The spring light fell in soft patches across Margaret Holloway's porch that morning. The tulips she planted decades ago had pushed through again, stubborn as memory. At 68, she moved slower now, but her mind was sharp, her humor intact. What had faded was company. Friends had moved away, her husband gone nearly 10 years. The house was too quiet, even with the radio playing songs from the 60s. When Ethan Cross first appeared, it wasn't thunder or music that marked his arrival, just the polite clearing of a throat. He was 30, maybe, clean-cut, with the easy confidence of someone who had learned how to smile for a living. He'd come to help with a small tax issue, or so he said. A referral from her old accountant. Margaret offered him lemonade. He complimented the roses. It was ordinary conversation, yet something stirred, a warmth she had forgotten the texture of. Ethan listened with patient eyes, laughing in the right places. When he asked about her late husband, he didn't hurry her answer. That patience felt like kindness. Later, she stood at the doorway, watching him drive away, wondering why the air smelled new again. Clara Whitman, her oldest friend, had warned her about young men with perfect smiles. But Clara hadn't heard him say her paintings still looked alive. For Margaret, it was enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, life still had another season left to bloom. Weeks drifted into a quiet rhythm of visits. Ethan Cross returned often, each time with a reason that sounded thoughtful. He said technology could simplify her finances. No more long lines, no more paper checks. He spoke of streamlining, but the word felt almost romantic when he said it. In the afternoons, he'd sit at her kitchen table, sleeves rolled up, teaching her how online banking worked. She'd laugh at her own mistakes, and he'd reach over, steadying her hand on the mouse, his touch light but deliberate. There was something comforting about how confidently he moved through her home, making the space feel full again. Clara noticed, of course. "He's charming," she said one evening, "but charm is a salesman's handshake." Margaret smiled it off, but her friend's worry stayed somewhere beneath her ribs. Still, Ethan made her feel seen. He listened when she spoke about art, about the gallery she once owned downtown, the one she had closed after her husband's passing. "You should reopen it," he said. "People forget beauty too quickly." When he left that night, the faint scent of his cologne lingered in the hallway long after the door closed. Margaret Holloway sat in her armchair, papers spread before her, trusting the neat columns of numbers he'd drawn. Outside, rain began tapping against the glass, a soft percussion to a promise forming in her heart. Summer arrived gently, wrapping the town in long golden evenings. Margaret Holloway had grown used to hearing two sets of footsteps in her house, hers and Ethan Cross's. He had become part of her days in small, quiet ways, refilling the sugar jar, fixing the wobbly porch rail, answering phone calls before she could. When her son, Daniel Holloway, came to visit, the change unsettled him. He found Ethan at the dining table, sleeves rolled, typing on Margaret's laptop. His mother's laughter drifted in from the kitchen, light and unfamiliar. Daniel watched silently, then asked, "Who's he?" Ethan stood with polished ease. "Ethan Cross," he said. "I'm helping your mother with her investments." Daniel's smile didn't reach his eyes. Later, when they were alone, he spoke softly but firmly. "Mom, you don't need help from a stranger." Margaret bristled. "He's been kind. You'd see that if you looked past your pride." It wasn't pride. It was fear. The kind that grows when something feels just a little too perfect. But she wouldn't hear it. That night, after Daniel left, Margaret sat by the window, watching Ethan lock the front gate. His figure in the lamplight looked steady, dependable. She told herself her son was wrong. Love, after all, didn't have to make sense to anyone else. By autumn, the rhythm between them had deepened into something that looked, from the outside, like devotion. Ethan encouraged her to reopen the old art gallery as a charitable space for children. "It's time your husband's legacy became yours," he said. Margaret loved the idea. She signed the papers he prepared, the ink flowing easily beneath her trust. Each new document felt like progress, renewal even. Clara Whitman stopped by one afternoon, her eyes scanning the walls where new paintings now hung. "You look happy," she said. But her tone carried a question. Margaret only smiled. "He's made me believe again." Ethan began managing the gallery's accounts, telling her not to worry about the technical side. The deposits went through him now, as did the donations. She felt lighter, free of burdens she once carried alone. But sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression shifted, brief flashes of distance, as if calculating something unseen. Margaret brushed them away. After all, love was about trust, wasn't it? and trust, she told herself, was what made two hearts beat as one. Yet in the quiet corners of the gallery, beneath the hum of the lights, a small unease lingered, soft as dust, waiting to be noticed. The first doubt arrived quietly, as most do, not as a storm, but as a whisper that wouldn't leave. Margaret Holloway had just returned from the gallery when she noticed the phone light blinking red. A message had come in while she was gone. She pressed play, expecting Clara's cheerful voice or the bank's reminder call. Instead, a woman's tone, calm, professional, too familiar, filled the room. "Ethan, I've handled the paperwork. Call me before morning. We'll need her signature again." Margaret froze. The her lingered in the air like smoke. When Ethan arrived that evening, she asked about it, lightly, as if it were nothing. He didn't flinch. "Oh, that's Victoria Price," he said smoothly. "A lawyer friend. She's helping file the trust documents. You remember, the ones for the Children's Gallery Fund?" He smiled as he spoke, pouring her tea as though everything was normal. And yet, when he touched her shoulder, something had changed. His warmth no longer reached her heart. That night, Margaret sat awake by the window, listening to the creak of the house, wondering why love suddenly felt heavier than comfort. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that people could still be good. But in the quiet, her husband's old words returned. Words once said with a knowing smile. "Not everyone who holds your hand means to keep it." It was a Tuesday morning when the world began to tilt. Margaret Holloway was arranging fresh flowers in the gallery, a habit she loved, a touch of grace before visitors arrived. The phone rang, and she answered without thought, smiling as she always did. "Mrs. Holloway?" The voice was polite, distant. "We're calling to confirm the transfer approvals for Mr. Cross." Her fingers tightened around the receiver. "I'm sorry, the what?" There was a pause. Then, with careful diction, the banker explained that several large transfers had been initiated over the past week, from her accounts to newly opened ones under Ethan Cross's name. Margaret's mind emptied. The flowers slipped from her hand, petals scattering like small soft echoes of disbelief. "Ma'am," the voice continued, "we just need to verify." But she had already hung up. Her heart pounded as she rushed home. The drawers were slightly open, papers missing. Ethan's cologne still lingered faintly, but he was gone. His phone went straight to voicemail. The afternoon light dimmed as realization sank in, the kind that steals the breath before tears can form. Every signature she had written, every document he had placed before her, they had not been symbols of partnership. They had been keys, and she had handed them all to the thief who once called her Angel. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, silent, soft, and utterly indifferent. The silence in Margaret Holloway's house felt different now. It wasn't the gentle quiet of a life lived peacefully. It was the hollow space after a storm has taken everything but the walls. She moved through the rooms like someone walking through memory. Every chair, every cup, every framed photograph had a shadow of him. Ethan Cross had not just taken her savings, he had taken the warmth that filled her days. The news spread through town faster than she could catch her breath. Neighbors who once smiled from across the street now whispered behind half-closed doors. Words like gullible and lonely widow floated through the air, sharp as glass. Clara Whitman came the next morning, holding her friend tightly, saying nothing. There were no words that could fit inside a wound that deep. When Clara offered to help call the police, Margaret simply nodded. Not because she believed justice would come, but because it was the only thing left to do. The days blurred into weeks. Investigators came and went, papers were filed, names were searched. But Ethan had vanished as smoothly as he had arrived. One evening, while sitting in her empty gallery, Margaret found a small note tucked inside a drawer. Ethan's handwriting. It read, "Don't hate me. You made me believe in something I couldn't afford." She folded the paper, placed it inside a book, and stared at the fading light. Love, she thought, doesn't always end in betrayal. Sometimes it ends in silence that refuses to leave. Months passed before Ethan Cross was finally found. He wasn't caught in a chase or a confession, just a routine traffic stop in another state. The arrest made the local paper, his photograph small and expressionless. When Margaret Holloway saw it, she felt neither anger nor relief, only exhaustion. Some victories arrived too late to matter. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. Margaret sat quietly beside her lawyer, her posture steady, her heart not so much beating as enduring. Across the room, Ethan avoided her eyes. The man who once knew every detail of her smile now studied the floor as though it could save him. Judge Reynolds read the charges aloud. fraud, identity theft, misappropriation of funds. Each count sounded clinical, detached from the ache it represented. The forged signatures were projected on a screen, her handwriting filling the room like a confession. When asked to speak, Ethan's voice wavered. "I never meant to hurt her," he said. "I just didn't know how to stop." The judge didn't respond. The law has no language for heartbreak. The verdict came swiftly. He was sentenced, and the gallery's accounts were ordered for restitution, though most of the money was already gone. As Margaret left the courthouse, reporters called her name. She kept walking, the winter air sharp against her cheeks. In the reflection of the glass doors, she caught her own image, not the victim of a con, but a woman still standing. And in that moment, she understood. Ethan had stolen her fortune, but not her story. Spring returned quietly that year, almost as if testing whether Margaret Holloway still believed in renewal. The gallery had been emptied, paintings sold, shelves bare, walls echoing. Yet Margaret didn't sell the building. Something in her refused to close the door completely. Her son, Daniel Holloway, came more often now. He brought groceries, carried boxes, fixed leaky pipes. There were still unspoken things between them. Years of distance, built from pride and misunderstanding. But grief has a way of softening the sharp edges of family. One morning, while sorting through old supplies, Margaret found her late husband's paintbrushes, stiff, dried with color from another life. She smiled faintly, remembering how he'd always said, "You don't start over, you start smaller." So she did. With what little money she had left, she reopened one small room in the gallery. No fanfare, no donors, no grand speeches. Just an open door, a pot of coffee, and a sign outside that read, "The Second Bloom, Art Classes for Seniors." The first week, only 2 people showed up. A widower who painted his dog from memory, and a retired teacher who wanted to draw her childhood home. Their laughter filled the empty space better than any music ever had. In helping others find color again, Margaret found her own. The world had taken her wealth, but not her ability to create something gentle from the wreckage. Each evening, she locked the door herself, whispering goodnight to the paintings drying on the walls. There was no audience now, no applause, but there was peace. And peace, she realized, was its own kind of fortune. 3 years passed before Margaret Holloway saw Ethan Cross's name again. It appeared on the evening news, between a weather update and a pharmaceutical commercial. The anchor spoke briskly. Former financial advisor Ethan Cross has been sentenced to additional years in prison after a string of fraud cases were reopened. His face flashed on the screen. Older, thinner, eyes dull. The man who once charmed her into believing in forever now looked like a stranger trying to remember who he used to be. Margaret didn't speak. She simply turned off the television and sat in the stillness that followed. The clock ticked softly. The rain tapped against the windows as if the world were bowing its head in quiet sympathy. Daniel found her that way, hands folded, gaze steady. "Mom," he said gently, "you okay?" She nodded. "I'm fine. Just thinking how strange it is. Forgiveness doesn't need witnesses." Later, she stepped outside into the cool evening. The garden had come alive again, roses pushing through, stubborn and bright. The same ones Ethan once admired. She leaned down, brushing her fingertips across a petal, and smiled. Not the smile of someone who forgot the past, but of someone who had learned to live beside it. Forgiveness hadn't come easily. It hadn't come quickly. But it had arrived in its own time, like the seasons, quietly, faithfully, without demand. Inside, the clock struck 8. The gallery's lights glowed through the window, and the laughter of her students carried into the street. Margaret Holloway stood there for a while, breathing in the spring air, and whispered into the dusk, "I'm still here, and I still believe in love." The years that followed were gentle, the way evening light softens after a long day. Margaret Holloway found herself surrounded by color again, not from wealth, but from life, returning in small, unexpected ways. The art room, the second bloom, had grown busier each season. The chatter of students replaced what used to be silence. Their laughter carried down the hallways that once echoed with loss. Every face held a story. A retired nurse who painted her first sunrise. A widower who learned to sculpt just to keep the loneliness busy. They came broken, shy, uncertain, just as she had once been. And week after week, they left a little lighter. Daniel Holloway still visited every Thursday evening. Sometimes they cooked together. Simple meals, quiet talk. The old resentment between them had softened into something gentler, the kind of love that doesn't ask for words. He once told her, "You gave everything away, Mom, but somehow you got richer." She smiled at that. He didn't mean money, of course. He meant the way she looked now, calm, assured, unafraid. Every so often, someone new would ask about the story behind the name The Second Bloom. Margaret would pause before answering, her gaze drifting to the old photograph of the gallery's first grand opening, taken decades ago. "It's about believing in what's left," she would say softly, "not what was taken." She had stopped hating Ethan Cross a long time ago. Hatred was too heavy to carry, and forgiveness, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't excuse but releases, had become her art form. Each stroke of her brush felt like a breath given back to life, and with every new painting she realized the truth. Love, when it returns, doesn't always come as a person. Sometimes it comes as peace. One early autumn morning, the air carried the first chill of the season. The maple trees outside the gallery had begun to turn, red and gold flickering like small fires against the sky. Margaret Holloway sat by the window, a cup of tea warming her hands, watching the day unfold slowly. Daniel came by before work, as he often did. He noticed the small smile on her face and asked, "What are you thinking about?" She looked up, her eyes distant but kind. "About how love changes shape," she said. "How it starts out like a promise and ends up like a lesson." He sat beside her, quiet, letting her words linger. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. Margaret considered the question. "No," she said after a long pause, "because even when love breaks you, it still reminds you that your heart can open, that it can still feel." The clock ticked in the background, unhurried. Outside, a few students arrived early, their laughter bright against the morning calm. She stood, straightened her shawl, and looked around the studio. Walls filled with color, shelves lined with stories. This was her legacy now. Not money, not status, but the proof that life could bloom again after heartbreak. As Daniel left, he kissed her forehead. "I'll see you tonight," he said. When the door closed, Margaret turned toward the window once more. The light touched her face gently, almost as if the universe was nodding in approval. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "I gave him my heart once, but I kept the better part for myself." And with that, she walked into the gallery, the smell of paint and coffee wrapping around her like an old friend. The world outside moved on, but inside The Second Bloom, time stood still, honoring the woman who lost everything and still found a way to love again. In the end, she gave him her heart at 68. He gave it to the bank at 30. It was never just about betrayal. It was about what survives it. Margaret Holloway didn't rebuild her fortune. She rebuilt her faith in living. Because sometimes the real victory isn't in getting back what was taken, but in refusing to let the loss define what remains. There's a kind of strength that doesn't shout. It hums quietly, like a heartbeat that's been through the storm and still chooses to keep time. That's the kind of love Margaret carried to the end. Not the kind that binds, but the kind that frees. So if this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments. What moment in Margaret Holloway's journey moved you the most? And if you were listening closely, you might notice how often Margaret Holloway's name came up. Drop your answer in the comments. We may feature your name in a shout-out as a thank you for being part of our Fiction Echoes family. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this one, the next chapter is already waiting. Just click the video that's about to appear, and we'll see you there. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a moment of what happens next. Because sometimes the quietest stories echo the longest.